There is a sealed ledger in an old Charleston archive, a file stamped and folded with a warning that still chills anyone who finds it. Inside, 8 men record the same wound: precise, surgical, private. Each morning a planter awakened to a silence where his life had been cut away. Those pages whisper a name the record books will not: Silas the Silent, a slave who could not cry, whose throat had been broken as a boy, who learned to watch and remember and in the hush between tides to answer. Listen if you want this truth anchored in you. Type "The Veil is Broken" twice in the comments to seal it. If this channel pulls you toward history's other channels, duck, subscribe now, and tell me where you are listening from, your city, your state. Drop it below. This is not sensationalism. This is reconstruction from fragments the powerful agreed to forget. The Low Country in the 1830s, a beauty that hides a system dedicated to erasing people. Rice swamps, tidal canals, fever, and invisible rules. Wealth that tasted of human bones. Silas was born into that silence. His mother worked the mud. His father was noted only by the color of his skin. He learned carpentry, learned the patterns of keys and doors, learned which men visited the outbuildings after dusk. What follows is not accusation without cause, but a stitch-by-stitch tracing of a revenge the law refused to name. I will speak for the silences you are taught to ignore. Stay with me. He learned to map the rhythms of power like a cartographer maps coastlines, memorizing which doors opened into predation and which paths carried safety. He made his silence a weapon of observation in a world that counted speech as possibility for revolt. Silence became cover and leverage. There is a moral geometry here. A system that permits violation cannot then be shocked when the violated bend the compass toward retribution. Oral histories later would carry fragments: a name, a whisper, a furtive glance exchanged at dusk among the quarters. People who lived under oppression developed languages of their own, codes stitched into songs, gestures, small acts of care that sustained them. But some of those acts were heavy with risk. To speak was to invite destruction. To point to an owner was to risk collective punishment. Silas navigated these constraints with a patience that looked like emptiness to those who expected spectacle. Each episode of retaliation was both an erasure and a statement, a refusal that the law would ever declare. The men who woke to blood understood that something sacred had been violated within them, and they feared to confess the actions that had invited such a response. In the enslaved community, gratitude and fear braided together: gratitude for an unknown protector, and fear that acknowledgement would lead to ruin. The more the authorities searched, the less sense they made of motive. Motive had been folded into a private ledger of injuries that the planters had decided to hide. Silas's craft allowed him unusual access. His hands mended what the masters broke. His knowledge of locks and carpentry proved useful in ways that would become terrible. There is an old logic in oppressed communities. When law refuses remedy, justice migrates into other forms. The pattern that emerged was precise enough to suggest planning, but ghost-like enough to dodge the nets set to catch it. Silas's childhood was an inventory of small impossibilities, nights spent with a throat that answered only by rasp and a body trained to obey. At 13, a plantation physician wrote a sterile note: laryngeal damage, and the ledger moved on. No one recorded the hands that made that damage. No one asked. What remained was a man who could not voice outrage, and so let his eyes become instruments. He watched the rituals of entitlement: who came, where they went, what they brought with them. The planters assumed a mute field hand had no knowledge of shame. They were wrong. Silas moved between properties like a shadow. Hired out for carpentry, he slept in sheds, ate alone, and returned to his own plantation at dawn. Each time a man who had visited him in the hours before would be discovered wounded in ways that stripped his dignity but left life intact. A living ruin. The pattern did not fit simple rage. It fit design, precision, timing, and understanding of bodies and darkness. No official record connected these visits to the attacks. Men kept secrets that the law protected. The elite preferred shame sealed behind shutters rather than public humiliation. So the ledger stayed quiet. The sheriff's inquiries stalled, and terror migrated through closed doors. He learned to map the rhythms of power like a cartographer maps coastlines, memorizing which doors opened into predation and which paths carried safety. He made his silence a weapon of observation In a world that counted speech as possibility for revolt, silence became cover and leverage. There is a moral geometry here, a system that permits violation cannot then be shocked when the violated bend the compass toward retribution. Oral histories later would carry fragments, a name, a whisper, a furtive glance exchanged at dusk among the quarters. People who lived under oppression developed languages of their own, codes stitched into songs, gestures, small acts of care that sustained them. But some of those acts were heavy with risk. To speak was to invite destruction, to point to an owner was to risk collective punishment. Silas navigated these constraints with a patience that looked like emptiness to those who expected spectacle. Each episode of retaliation was both an erasure and a statement, a refusal that the law would ever declare. The men who woke to blood understood that something sacred had been violated within them, and they feared to confess the actions that had invited such a response. In the enslaved community, gratitude and fear braided together, gratitude for an unknown protector and fear that acknowledgement would lead to ruin. The more the authorities searched, the less sense they made of motive. Motive had been folded into a private ledger of injuries that the planters had decided to hide. Silas's craft allowed him unusual access. His hands mended what the masters broke. His knowledge of locks and carpentry proved useful in ways that would become terrible. There is an old logic in oppressed communities. When law refuses remedy, justice migrates into other forms. The pattern that emerged was precise enough to suggest planning, but ghost-like enough to dodge the nets set to catch it. Silas moved between properties like a shadow. Hired out for carpentry, he slept in sheds, ate alone, and returned to his own plantation at dawn. Each time a man who had visited him in the hours before would be discovered wounded in ways that stripped his dignity but left life intact. A living ruin. The pattern did not fit simple rage. It fit design, precision, timing, and understanding of bodies and darkness. No official record connected these visits to the attacks. Men kept secrets that the law protected. The elite preferred shame sealed behind shutters rather than public humiliation. So the ledgers stayed quiet, the sheriff's inquiries stalled, and terror migrated through closed doors. He learned to map the rhythms of power like a cartographer maps coastlines, memorizing which doors opened into predation and which paths carried safety. He made his silence a weapon of observation in a world that counted speech as possibility for revolt. Silence became cover and leverage. There is a moral geometry here, a system that permits violation cannot then be shocked when the violated bend the compass toward retribution. Oral histories later would carry fragments, a name, a whisper, a furtive glance exchanged at dusk among the quarters. People who lived under oppression developed languages of their own. Codes stitched into songs, gestures, small acts of care that sustained them. But some of those acts were heavy with risk. To speak was to invite destruction. To point to an owner was to risk collective punishment. Silas navigated these constraints with a patience that looked like emptiness to those who expected spectacle. Each episode of retaliation was both an erasure and a statement, a refusal that the law would ever declare. The men who woke to blood understood that something sacred had been violated within them, and they feared to confess the actions that had invited such a response. In the enslaved community, gratitude and fear braided together, gratitude for an unknown protector and fear that acknowledgement would lead to ruin. The more the authorities searched, the less sense they made of motive. Motive had been folded into a private ledger of injuries that the planters had decided to hide. Silas's craft allowed him unusual access. His hands mended what the masters broke. His knowledge of locks and carpentry proved useful in ways that would become terrible. There is an old logic in oppressed communities. When law refuses remedy, justice migrates into other forms. The pattern that emerged was precise enough to suggest planning, but ghost-like enough to dodge the nets set to catch it. He learned to map the rhythms of power like a cartographer maps coastlines, memorizing which doors opened into predation and which paths carried safety. He made his silence a weapon of observation. In a world that counted speech as possibility for revolt, silence became cover and leverage. Silas moved like a tool that belonged to no one and everybody at once. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to bind this truth to you. If you value these stories, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Leave your city or state in the comments. The map of listeners matters. The low-country houses are bright in daylight. At night their private lives look like debts unpaid. Planters carried in their pockets a moral ledger, as well things they purchased with their power, things they refused to confess. The attacks followed a rhythm that thinned the veneer of respectability. A man found bleeding in his own locked room. A wife who could say only later that she had heard nothing. A doctor who took a careful inventory and wrote sterile Latin into the county book. The sheriff called it an anomaly. The paper called it misfortune. Southerners called it a shame they would not state in public. In the quarters, the story told itself differently. People spoke in metaphors and old proverbs, and names carried like charm stones in a pocket. There was mention of a silent man who listened like a knife studies a seam. Silas had learned to move without making the habits of others aware. He read the cadence of nights when owners became their basest selves. His skill with wood and locks gave him a plausible reason to be in outbuildings long after the sun had set. But plausible and permissible are not the same. When an owner visited a shed, he expected discretion. He believed the shed existed to hold secrets. He forgot that the shed also held witnesses if one paid attention. The ledger that later historians found lists facts, dates, names, medical notes. It does not list the small errands, the carpentry jobs, the names of the men who lingered by stables or mill houses. Those omissions were deliberate. The planters protected a code of silence that was part self-preservation, part pride. They would not confess to the things that made them vulnerable, because confession risked public humiliation and social exile. Thus the truth migrated underground, lived in whispered warnings, in women's songs, in the way children were told not to wander after dark. Silas used those silences like maps. He turned assumed invisibility into a kind of mobility, moving from one patched roof to the next, noting footprints in the mud, learning which men favored which outbuildings. Where the law looked for burglars, he saw patterns of access and invitation. No official investigation connected the visits to the injuries because official records were not designed to suggest uncomfortable moral causation. Reports emphasized mystery and unknown assailants. They hid shame with the same delicate hand that hid accounts of property or debt. The men who could have answered would not speak of their actions before the attacks. To admit that a master had visited a shed, to admit the business that was done in those outbuildings, was to risk being ostracized. Reputation could be lost faster than land, so investigators circled like birds above something they could not see, pecking at fragments and finding only the husks. Meanwhile, talk in the quarters took a different shape. Stories traveled as encoded lessons. Mothers would warn girls about certain kinds of smiles. Older men would whisper that some things you learn by listening twice. Part of Silas's power lay in this duality. He could be hired out and remain invisible in plain sight. His employers saw a useful hand and not a mind. They assumed that muteness meant incapacity. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Whereas a speaking man could be maneuvered into confession or punished for speech, a silent man could avoid suspicion and, more dangerously for the system, could study its soft underbelly. He learned the private rhythms of predation and how certain men performed righteousness in daylight and indulged vice by lamplight. The pattern of the attacks, their surgical precision, suggested someone who understood anatomy, who could disable without leaving a cacophony of alarm. That understanding might have come from the work of a field doctor, from a butcher, or from patient observation. In a society that treated bodies as instruments of production, knowledge about how to disable a body could be acquired like any other skill. But skill and motive are different beasts. The former can be taught, the latter must be born. Silas bore a motive that combined personal injury, communal memory, and a refusal to let humiliation go unanswered. He enacted what law would not, a form of recompense coded in pain for those who had made a habit of taking. And yet, for all the violence inflicted, the method was not wanton. There was a deliberate sparing of life, a calculation that left the victim conscious enough to carry knowledge of what had been done and yet powerless to name the agent. That calculus mattered. It made the attacks both punishment and message: you will live knowing, because the law will never make you pay. The plantation world had many blind spots. And the most important was the assumption that the legal and social order could never be overturned from within. Masters planned defenses against theft and revolt, but they refused to patrol their own appetites. They regulated the roads and the passes and left their personal ledger of abuses sealed. Silas learned the exact coordinates of those blind spots. He learned which men believed their private behavior would stay private because the ritual of power guaranteed it. He watched them unburden themselves in outbuildings and counted the steps back to the main house. Sometimes he overheard parts of conversations. Sometimes he merely watched hands move in the dark. It might be hard to believe that a man rendered voiceless as a child by violence could become an agent of such deliberate consequences, but that is precisely the cruel arithmetic of oppression. What breaks a person can also harden them into a weapon. The pattern of the attacks had a rhythm. Visits, then a wound discovered within 48 hours. The police saw only the aftermath. They could not see the antecedent presence of the laborer who had been sent for a day or two to mend a roof or fix a wheel. Those short assignments were common, hired hands traveled. No one thought to ask why a particular hired hand appeared on so many properties in the weeks before each attack. Silence is an affordance when your presence is deemed harmless. Silas used that affordance. He turned hired labor into reconnaissance. He turned carpentry into a cover for observation. The more precise the surgical work, the clearer the speaker of a language the masters had never permitted. He knew how to leave no mess, no blood trail beyond what a doctor could treat. He knew the value of leaving a man alive enough to remember, alive enough to carry shame into his social network. It was a cruel pedagogy. It taught that power could be answered by pain without the law ever admitting fault. In the quarters, people watched a different ledger being written. They felt a strange relief when news came that another master had been found incapable of certain kinds of dominion. Yet relief always came with a household cost. After each attack came reprisals, searches, random violence designed to reassert control. That was the price of knowledge the community could not celebrate. It could only whisper thanks and then brace for the backlash. Silas's silence was both a shield and a sentence. If you value these stories, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Leave your city or state in the comments. The map of listeners matters. He carried the memory of a throat broken in adolescence like a private litany. He walked among people who assumed brokenness meant helplessness and used that misreading to move where others could not. His skill set made him useful. His invisibility made him forgettable. That forgettability is what protected him in a world designed to punish attention. The early victims of the campaign were men who occupied that odd social place where reputation mattered more than confession. They had the means to hide the momentary truths of their nights, to gossip in drawing rooms rather than on courthouse steps. So investigators hit dead ends and moved on. The servants and field hands who might have known something were threatened, punished, and dismissed. Meanwhile, Silas continued to be sent to jobs across the low country, roof patches, mill repairs, fence mending. His presence became a pattern only when someone looked hard enough to connect the location dots. And the county authorities rarely looked hard enough where the stains of privilege might be revealed. In the quarters, older women spoke of a man who seemed to have been made of shadow and patience. A formerly enslaved witness decades later described Silas as someone whose eyes seemed to hold the weight of water, deep and unreadable. For those who knew the underside of plantation life, the concept of retributive justice was not foreign. They had their own languages of resistance, hidden tools, songs with encoded instructions, and small conspiracies of protection. Silas's actions fit within that history. They also transcended it. He was not merely protecting. He was punishing in a way meant to unmake the privilege that allowed owners to take. The attacks were not indiscriminate. They targeted specific men whose private behavior had violated the bodies and dignity of the enslaved. That selectivity mattered. It suggested moral calculus rather than lunacy. But selectivity also brought danger, because if someone traced motive, people who cared for Silas could be targeted. After each event, patrols increased, and random violence followed. The pattern of retaliation by authorities was predictable. When they couldn't catch a proximate cause, they lashed out at the proximate community. That made silence a necessary survival tool for everyone in the quarters, not only for Silas. There was a ritual the quarters used to keep certain knowledge safe, a phrase, a repetition, a small act of acknowledgement performed only in trusted company. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this with me now. If you value these stories, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Leave your city or state in the comments. The map of listeners matters. The communities developed a network of mutual aid where naming and not naming were equally powerful. Some details were deliberately obscured to prevent infiltration by overseers. Some details were given the urgency of folklore so everyone would remember whom to protect. Silas existed within these protective economies of memory, but often stood apart because of his singularness. He had no family on record after his mother's recorded death. He had no kin whose names would appear in the ledger. That absence made him an easier puzzle to ignore and a harder one to trace. His method, get hired, appear harmless, observe, then act, required calm and exactitude. He did not act out of a blind fury. He acted in a measured sequence that made each man a living monument to his own shame. The victims always survived, they did not die. This was by design. To be left alive was to keep the humiliation visible and unresolvable within the planter's world. A living ruin is a more enduring message than a corpse, because the ruined man continues to participate in the social rituals that make him ashamed. He sits at supper, he attends church, he meets his peers, and he carries the wound like a confession he will not speak. That was the terror, not the act itself, but the way it stayed with its victims. For the enslaved who whispered of Silas, the acts had a sacramental sense, a way of turning private violation into public knowledge without the masters ever admitting the wrongdoing that led to it. Yet every revelation brought reprisals. After an attack, patrols scoured roads, interrogations increased, and innocent people were sold off as a deterrent. The quarters learned to receive the protection and the punishment at once. They also learned the economy of risk, speak, and risk the lives of many, stay silent and let injustice hold. Silas lived inside that contradiction and used it to carry out his work. The first documented case in the ledger that researchers later recovered described a man found in his bed at dawn, blood on the sheets, a wound that a surgeon called precise. Local men called it an intruder, a burglar, a madman. The white world preferred mystery to confession. It is easier to blame a phantom than to admit you have been violated by what you are supposed to own. In the quarters, the story traveled with more edges, who had been in the shed, what doors had been left unlocked, which slave had been loaned for the day. Those details rarely made it into official files, because to record them would be to record the master's shame. Silas had been sent to work that day. He slept in a storage room, he received his meals, he left in the morning like any hired hand. The master who had visited the shed left carved spaces in his dignity that could not be stained out. Later, when the man was discovered, he would not tell the full truth. He feared social death more than physical scandal. The sheriff pursued leads among the enslaved and punished without finding cause. The local press printed short dispatches and then moved on to matters less likely to unsettle genteel society. But rumors among enslaved people suggested a different narrative, that a silent man had been present, and that presence had been followed by retribution. The thing about patterns is that they are invisible to those who refuse to look in the right place. Officials searched fields and roads, but rarely the logistics of hired labor, the small economy of rentals and temporary assignments that allowed a skilled hand to travel between estates. Those movements created the perfect cover for someone who wanted to be both present and unnoticed. Silas leveraged that economy. He became a predictable presence in the days leading up to each incident, a fact left out of official inquiries, because it implicated behaviors the planter class would rather not discuss. His skill with wood allowed him to appear useful, his silence allowed him to be forgotten. That forgetfulness was his protection until suspicion began to circle closer. Silas's presence on multiple properties in the days before each attack was the single fact that, if properly connected, would have unraveled the whole mystery. If you value these stories, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Leave your city or state in the comments. The map of listeners matters. But the planters protected one another with a silence born of honor and shame. They could not admit the activities that had left them exposed. In a culture where reputation functioned as currency, confession about private vice was worse than a public wound. So investigators were misled by their own assumptions. They assumed a single lunatic or a random criminal or a runaway. They did not assume a pattern rooted in the very social mechanisms that created vulnerability. Meanwhile, Silas continued to move, to work, to return, and to observe. He noticed the small consistencies that build up to the obvious, which doors were left unlatched at particular hours, which men closed themselves away when storms gathered, which overseers turned their heads when a master crossed a boundary. He assembled these data in a kind of ledger of his own, not of property but of offense. He catalogued the who and the when and used that quiet information to choose his moments. His attacks were not random. They were responses calibrated to the rhythms of shame. The men who had been targeted had a history of private transgressions, acts that the legal system would never record because the victims were property. Silas's revenge therefore performed two functions. It punished an individual and it exposed a system that depended on secrecy. That exposure, though indirect, threatened the social order because it rendered visible the mechanisms of private violence. For planters, the solution was to tighten control, to increase patrols, to subject whole communities to suspicion. That reprisal strategy had its own logic. When you cannot catch the perpetrator, terrorize the possible witnesses into silence. It is worth noting that each escalation of repression made the quarters more dangerous, and yet also made the narrative around Silas more mythic. He became not only a man, but a story that shaped behavior in ways the authorities could not easily measure. There were witnesses who later told parts of the story in interviews and in whispered recollections recorded decades after emancipation. Their testimony was fragmentary but consistent in tone. A man light-skinned, to some descriptions mute by injury, who moved like a shadow and watched like a judge. They spoke not in precise legal language, but in the language of memory metaphors, sensory images, and the rhythms of speech that carry communal trauma. Those accounts filled the gaps the official records left blank, and when pieced together, they suggested a coherence the sheriffs had failed to see. The men who were attacked shared one unspoken trait. They trusted too much in the immunity of their private acts. They had mistaken secrecy for safety. The first attacks did not create panic among the planter class so much as a defensive tightening of manners. Doors were bolted, pistols kept near beds, and men began to travel in pairs more often. But these surface measures were ineffective because the assault was not a brute force entry. It was a surgical, intimate interruption of occasions meant to be private. The perpetrators, in this narrative Silas, did not want to scatter panic across the countryside. He wanted to alter social calculus to make the wound visible without allowing the law to provide remedy. That paradox mattered. It meant the attacks were as much about shifting the moral imagination as about retribution itself. For the enslaved who watched this unfold, the acts offered a kind of moral clarity that the law would not provide. They demonstrated that transgression, even when sanctioned by property law, could be answered. But every answer exacted a price. After each incident came increased surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and heightened brutality aimed at reasserting control. The quarters had to learn to accept the protection a silent avenger offered, and to endure the reprisals that followed. That acceptance was not free. It was a negotiation of survival. Silas's movements raised questions about agency, about strategy, and about the way oppressed people improvise systems of deterrence when formal institutions fail them. He was not a myth made by rumor, nor a supernatural figure conjured by fearful imaginations. The archival fragments, the oral testimonies, and the consistent pattern of events point to a human mind at work, one that understood how to use the master's own structures against him. Silas's choice to leave victims alive but mutilated had symbolic force. It refused to allow the law to smooth the memory into an official narrative of simple criminality. Instead, the victims carried their injuries as living accusations. The community that bore the immediate cost of each reprisal understood this strategy's logic. But gratitude was always mixed with fear. The household economies were fragile. One raid, one sale, one forced relocation could destroy families who had little to begin with. so the quarters learned a political economy of secrecy and gratitude. You speak only where necessary, protect those you can, and grieve in forms that could not be read by outsiders. Silas fit into this economy as a kind of moral instrument, a man whose presence recalibrated power by exposing private sin in a public way. Yet the operation required patience and a cold assessment of risk. It required him to travel, to be hired, to return, and to remain invisible where visibility would have doomed the whole enterprise. The more methodical the attacks, the harder they were to dismiss as random. The more methodical they were, the more they suggested deliberation rather than madness. This distinction mattered to both sides. To planters it meant an organized threat. To the quarters it meant a form of justice crafted from necessity. When the number of victims climbed, pressure on authorities grew. Newspapers began to editorialize that something systematic might be underway. Rewards were offered. Governors authorized extra patrols. But those public moves were defensive rather than investigative. They aimed to reassure the planter class rather than to reckon with the uncomfortable possibilities the attacks suggested. The press still avoided explicit mention of the unspoken acts that might have precipitated such revenge. A culture that preferred the appearance of gentility to the messy truth of its knights would not report the knights honestly. Meanwhile, life in the quarters adapted. People whispered names into songs and warnings into children's tales. They developed rituals to pass on to the next generation, a map of behaviors to avoid and a mnemonic for protection. Silas was an enigma in these rituals, part protector, part danger. He was praised quietly and feared obviously because anyone connected to him risked being suspected. Rumors circulated that he had been trained not only in carpentry but in the handling of sharp tools in ways that suggested a gruesome expertise. Others insisted he learned technique from watching a doctor or a butcher, or from experience of forced servitude in medical tasks. Regardless of origin, the knowledge existed and it was applied with restraint. The attacks did not aim at annihilation. They were calibrated, targeted, and designed to remain inscrutable to investigators who refused to interrogate the social habits that made these wounds possible. The result was a long, slow pressure on a social fabric already fraying. The planters increased cruelty to deter speculation, the quarters made contingency plans for possible reprisal, and Silas, whoever he was in daily life, continued his method, always mindful of the cost his actions imposed on those he sought to defend. As the cycle continued, the ledger that would later be found in the archives accumulated clinical notes and dates, but no moral commentary. The official voice remained careful, constrained by language that protects property and hides predation. Underneath that voice sat an alternate archive, the memory of the people who lived through it. Those oral accounts, recorded years later, preserved a different set of priorities, naming survivors, describing the shape of fear, and hinting at the tactical knowledge that allowed a man like Silas to operate. The contrasting records illustrate a truth about power. Institutions preserve the versions of events that affirm their dignity. Oppressed communities preserve the sequences that kept them alive. To reconstruct Silas's actions, modern readers must stitch these two sources together and accept that truth is often multipartite. There is also a moral complication here. Revenge erases innocence along with guilt. The men targeted were not faceless villains in a melodrama. They were complex figures with families, social obligations, and private lives. But within the plantation system, those private lives included acts the law protected through silence. The choice to retaliate against those acts, then, forces us to confront the insufficiency of legal frameworks that refuse to reckon with abuse when it is wrapped in property relations. Silas's work, as reconstructed, is not a clean moral object. It is an ugly instrument formed under duress. It carves at the hypocrisy of a social order that would rather conceal than confess. To tell the story is to confront that hypocrisy and to understand why, in some contexts, violent retribution becomes a perverse kind of accountability. The attacks carried consequences beyond the immediate victims. If you value these stories, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Leave your city or state in the comments. The map of listeners matters. After each incident, plantations increased monitoring of movement between estates. Overseers rode the roads more frequently, and patrols expanded their radius of suspicion. Random punishments escalated as a method of deterrence. Houses were searched, possessions confiscated, and people were sold to distant plantations without cause. The reprisal economy disproportionately harmed the very people the attacks had sought to protect. This cruel irony was not lost on those in the quarters. They had to weigh the protection a silent avenger offered against the likelihood of collective punishment. In some ways, that calculus defined the political logic of survival in the slave economy. Every act of resistance required a communal assessment of risk. Silas acted knowing these costs, which suggests a moral calculus that included sacrifice. His decisions were not private indulgence. They were choices made within a community's stubborn effort to assert dignity in a world that systematically denied it. Observers who later recounted the events often hinted at this communal negotiation, noting how people would gather quietly to decide whether to shelter a suspected person or to distance themselves for survival. That choice was bitter and immediate, and it shaped the way the story was told for generations. It made Silas both a savior and a burden, an ambiguous figure who protected some while imperiling others. His name became a cipher for a deeper truth, that oppressed people sometimes create agents of extraordinary violence because the formal institutions will not, or cannot, deliver justice. Silas's methods were surgical in part because they needed to be sustainable. Violence that invites overwhelming retaliation fails its original purpose by destroying the very capacity of the community to persist. The calibration, leaving victims alive, precise wounds rather than fatal ones, is a grim sign of strategic thinking under pressure. It shows an awareness of consequences and an attempt to maintain a long-term deterrent without provoking annihilation. This restraint, chilling as it is, indicates that the actor understood a larger web of cause and effect. He understood that the law's blind spots offered a narrow window to act and that any action outside that window would collapse into wreckage. For historians, this suggests not madness but craft. It suggests the application of skills in wood and metal to a different end, a kind of counter-architecture built not of rafters but of timing and moral pressure. Silas's life in the quarters was also shaped by this necessity. He could not be seen as conspiring publicly. He could not be known to those whose protection would jeopardize them. He had to be ghost-like, moving carefully between tasks, keeping his head down even as he catalogued private sins. That distance from community life made him less accessible as a person and more effective as a tactic. Yet it also meant he was alone with his choices. The archival record is silent on whether he sought counsel, whether elders weighed in, or whether he acted from a deeply personal vow. Oral histories hint at small meetings and coded talk, but they do not provide the sort of evidence a court would accept. This absence is telling. It means that much of what we reconstruct is interpretive, an attempt to make sense of action within constrained archives. The ambiguity complicates any straightforward moral judgment while still leaving room to recognize the structural cruelty that shaped the choices he made. History often asks whether violent resistance is justified, but that question flattens the lived experience of those who endured systemic violation. If you value these stories, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Leave your city or state in the comments. The map of listeners matters. The case of Silas forces us into a sharper inquiry. When law is complicit in harm by refusing to recognize certain injuries as legal harms at all, where does justice reside? For the enslaved, the law was an instrument of property, not a guarantor of personal safety. The only recourse available for certain kinds of violation was extra-legal and thus dangerous. Silas's approach sought to make an argument without lawyers to render visible the consequences of crimes the legal system would not register. In doing so, he rewired the communicative space of the plantation, forcing acknowledgement through suffering rather than through testimony. That strategy was inevitably brutal. It relied on bodily harm to convey moral claims. It traded in terror as a lesson. We must not romanticize it, but neither can we ignore the conditions that birthed it. Historians who later analyzed the ledger and the oral histories tried to locate patterns of movement and motive, and when those patterns emerged, they unearthed an uncomfortable truth. The system created both the wound and the engine of its revenge. Silas, in this reading, is a symptom as much as an agent, an expression of accumulated violations. The violence he exacted was horrifying. The environment that made that violence conceivable was longer and more pervasive. This dialectic is hard to hold. We must name the harm done by Silas and the harm that made him possible at once. Only by doing so can we avoid the moral simplifications that erase the structural accountability embedded in the story. The archival discovery in the early 21st century that pulled these fragments back into light was itself a study in institutional forgetting. A diligent graduate student found references, footnotes, and a sealed folder. A bureaucratic decision made in a different age to keep embarrassment private. The very act of sealing speaks volumes. What does a society protect when it seals its history? The answer in this case was a pattern of abuse and a string of victims that hinted at wrongdoing the community refused to name. Public institutions often sanitize their pasts to preserve continuity, but corruption does not vanish by being ignored. It calcifies in the archives. The clinical language of doctors and the cautious prose of sheriffs sit beside the blunt testimonies of the enslaved. To read them together is to see two worlds overlapping, one that seeks to maintain dignity through omission and one that insists on speaking truth through story. The modern reconstruction of Silas's life required assembling these pieces, weighing their reliability and accepting ambiguities. No single source held the whole story. Together they suggested a coherent pattern. The question then becomes less about proving a single narrative and more about understanding how institutions choose which narratives to institutionalize and which to bury. In this case, the choice to bury reveals a social economy that prioritized reputational protection over moral transparency. That choice allowed the cycle of predation and retribution to continue unchecked for years because the social costs of confession were too high. The ledger's existence in a sealed folder is a testament to that cowardice. When we place Silas within the broader currents of resistance, we see echoes of other forms of fight back that existed across slave society: sabotage, flight, covert communication, subtle acts of non-cooperation. His actions, however extreme, fit within a repertoire of tactics designed to disrupt the plantation's moral claims. He did not lead rebellions in the classical sense. He created a different kind of insurgency, one that targeted dignity and privacy rather than property or capital. That insurgency asked uncomfortable questions about who had the right to do harm with impunity and what happens when that right goes unpunished. In the quarters, people debated the ethics of his method in hushed tones. Some praised the intervention for making victims accountable in a world where law would not. Others feared the reprisal and the instability such acts invited. This debate matters because it reveals internal moral negotiations within oppressed communities. Resistance is rarely unanimous. It emerges from contested ideas about survival, dignity, and the best path to future safety. Silas's work forced those debates into sharper relief by converting private violation into public scandal without legal adjudication. That pressure reshaped behavior, not always in predictable ways. Some planters doubled down on secrecy, others began to fear that secrecy itself had become a liability. The social fabric strained under the weight of these revelations, and that strain altered relationships across the Low Country in ways both subtle and profound. Silas's legacy is messy, and that is the point. If you value these stories, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Leave your city or state in the comments. The map of listeners matters. He is neither saint nor monster in tidy categories. He is a human being shaped by systematic cruelty and driven to methods that forced moral recognition where institutions refused it. The ledger in the archive, the oral testimonies, the whispered songs in the quarters. Together they make a portrait that resists simple judgment. What they demand is attention to the conditions that made such an actor possible: laws that treated people as property, cultures that protected private vice, and communities that learned to survive through coded language and clandestine protection. When institutions seal away uncomfortable truths, they do not erase them. They store them in waiting, where they fester and shape behavior in unforeseen ways. The story of Silas the Silent is a testament to that dynamic. It is a painful mirror held up to a society that chose shame over confession and spectacle over justice. So before you move on, consider this. How many other sealed folders gather dust in archives because confessions are inconvenient? How many histories are smoothed over to protect reputations? Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments if you will carry this truth with you. Share where you are listening from. Connect the map of witnesses. And if this descent into hidden histories matters to you, subscribe. We will keep unsealing what was meant to remain hidden.